Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and welcome to season 14. Today, we're joined by Professor Christopher Paul Harris, Assistant Professor in the Department of Global and International Studies at the University of California, Irvine. He's the author to Build a Black Future, The Radical Politics of Joy, Pain, and Care. Of To Build a Black Future, the great friend of ours, Kathy J. Cohen, writes, Harris has written a powerful book on the movement for Black lives that details the ideology, practices, culture, and evolution of one of the most important organizations in both Black and left politics today. Although rooted in the Black radical tradition, Harris demonstrates how Movement for Black Lives is working to build a new movement rooted in Black queer feminisms that reimagines how we work for the freedom of Black and all people. How are you doing today, Professor Harris?
I'm doing well. Happy to be here with you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and we're happy to have this conversation with you. Let's start, the origin point of this book for you. You mentioned that you were, a Black Youth BYP 100 organizer for 3 years, but is there an earlier origin story to that activist work that brought you to this project?
Yeah, actually, it's funny to think about how these types of projects come together. This book was originally my dissertation, and I wasn't intentionally seeking out to do a book on movement. I was mostly interested in generational politics. I was interested in seeing how my generation of American millennials were rethinking the political, as it were, and movement was just one aspect of that, right? But when I ended up in movement space, right, joining BYP 100, entering as a researcher, right, I was transformed in the process, not just in terms of kind of shedding the researcher hat and becoming more of an organizer, which is something that happened over time, but just in terms of my own relationship to my own Blackness and how I understood what it meant to be in community with Black people. So the book really came out of that transformation, both personally and politically. But I don't claim to be or have been prior to this an activist or an organizer. I came in as a researcher, and I became an organizer during that process. Yeah.
I mean, you addressed some of this in the book. What do you think it was about that moment? Because we could point to so many different other moments, going back 30 years and, which Black folks were energized in certain kinds of ways. But there was something about this particular moment, you to place it in something on the timeline, right? You describe it as the time of Black Matters, Black Lives Matter, right? To distinguish it from these other kinds of moments.
Say his name! Say his name!
But what do you think it was about that moment that drew so many people into the space the way that it did?
Yeah, it's a great question. From my perspective, I think of it in two ways, both in terms of what I kind of encountered in engaging with people in movement space, and then my own personal journey. These two things were happening simultaneously, and I have to say, the hypervisibility of Black death and Black pain. To me, is the animating thing here, which isn't to say that Black pain and Black death is new, right? Obviously, it's not. Right. Black struggle is premised on Black pain and death to a large degree, right? But it's the way we've encountered it over the last decade, right? You can't escape it. It's not just a newspaper article or a bit on TV. It's all over the place. And in that crucial stretch, 2014, from Mike Brown to Philando Castile in 2016, all the way up to George Floyd, it's like you can't escape it. And I think that that hypervisibility, that prevalence of it, really was a key driver, not only into making the movement what it is, but which is to say, galvanizing people to the streets and to join organizations, but the form of the political culture itself.
Yeah. You say early in the book that, part of this moment is about, in your literal words, we must regard Black pain, champion Black joy. And there is a kind of mindset, I will say, that exists historically throughout Black politics, 20th century, early 21st century, that would pose the pursuit of Black joy as almost being antithetical to a Black politics, that would see it as something that was frivolous, right? In light of the reality of Black pain and trauma and the need to organize. Talk about how important Black joy was in the context of the movement for Black lives, right? And you as a researcher, trying to find a grounding in the work, someone who's being personally impacted, obviously, by the politics as we are. How important was it to locate joy and to be able to share a space for that joy in the context of the movement?
Yeah. I mean, it was central and is central. There was a quote from one of the organizers that I organized with in BYP 100 as part of the strategic plan that we were working on, and they said, without joy, we cannot win. Mm-hmm. Right? And so, in that sense, joy is the furthest thing from frivolous. It's a necessity. Yes, it's not just a counterweight to pain, although it is that, but it's a way that we can prefigure a future outside of that pain. Right? Joy is the thing that helps people get through the difficulty with organizing, right? The difficulty in organizing, the difficulty in being in space with people, dealing with, a violent world, right? So joy allows for the weight of the work to feel less burdensome. It allows us to see the possibility in a Black future or of a Black future. Yeah. It's a signal that not only have we survived, but that we thrive and that we can thrive. And as I said before, when we get to the other side of this, the thing that will remain is our joy.
You make a powerful argument here, and I think one of the best arguments made for the politics of this moment that distinguishes this moment from earlier political movements, right? The goals, the focus, the kind of inclusivity that you see in the movement for Black lives that you didn't see in previous movements. And you discuss this, in some ways in the context of the work of someone like Michael Dawson, and this idea that, when we look at these previous moments and movements, Black culture and Black political thought is really in a different space in American culture. Black music as a good example of this, right? As a good index of this is still a marginal form, right? Mm-hmm. Black entertainment is still a marginal form if we're looking at A. Philip Randolph organizing in the 1960s and 1940s, or even Martin Luther King and SCLC and those folks, Nick, organized in the 1960s. By the time we get to the movement for Black lives, Black culture is a centerpiece, right, of American culture, right? Whether we're hearing on the radio or watching on television, and at least because of those first 4.5 years of the Obama presidency, Black politics are also, right, in a centerpiece with that. How important was this kind of shift in the space of Black politics and Black culture? How important was it for the activists to really double down and bring that to the table as they engage this discourse around anti-Black violence?
Yeah. Great question. It seems to me that it manifested itself so organically and naturally, right? Look, it wasn't something that people attempted to do, or it's like, oh, this is what we should do. It's as if it went hand in hand, right? Yeah. And so this is one of the things about the study of politics and Black politics in general, the idea that the political and the cultural are somehow separate, right? or that the political has a weightier or more substantive essence than the cultural. And I think one of the things I try and talk about in the book, and I think we need to attend to, is the fact that there isn't a distinction between the two when it comes to Black life and Black struggle. And so, in the context of the movement, the cultural was always there. Now, what I will say is that there was definitely a self-conscious effort to make sure that grounding in the cultural,
leaning
into it was something that organizers and cultural workers put at the forefront of the movement, right? It was so it was there organically, naturally, and then intentionally foregrounded at the front. That's why you see during the uprisings in 2020, you see examples of Black joy. You see lots of singing, lots of dancing, lots of evidence of the importance of the cultural sphere to the political and the political to the cultural.
There's a way in which a book like yours, To Build a Black Future, couldn't have been written 50 years ago as a dissertation. And I say that because the messaging would have been to a researcher like you, your background, that one, it was too soon, right, to write about it, and two, you're too close to write about it. And I'm sure that came up in different kinds of ways as you were writing your dissertation and then also publishing this book. What is your response to that?
How could you write about movement in any other way?
Yeah.
Right? How can you do it? I mean, of course you can pretend to have this distance, and people have written about movement just through interviews, and you can do that, right? That is a way to do it, but I'm not sure that it's possible to capture the essence of a thing without actually being there, without it touching you. And so, to those who would say that it was too soon or too close, it's always difficult to write about something that is in process or is happening. But it's also vital that we do so in order to be able to understand what it is we're watching, even as it unfolds. And, again, I think the best way to capture something like that is to be there and speak from the position of that placement. And, honestly, it's still very deeply personal, like that time, right? And I hope that the book captures that level of intimacy, right? that kind of brings people into an understanding of movement that doesn't have a pretension of detachment.
So I'm going to use Black Twitter as a straw man, straw person, but more specifically a straw man in this context, without naming different factions of Black Twitter more explicitly. But you write about the movement for Black Lives mounting a compelling and sorely needed challenge to the logic and values that inform the modern world: racial capitalism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, carceral power, liberal democracy, and the nation state. How does the movement respond to those folks? And we're talking about earlier generations of Black activists who thinks that it's doing too much. That the baseline should always be, what does Black freedom look like? What does Black resistance look like? Right? Why are we bringing these other things into the mix in a way that feels distinctly, obviously, intellectual and scholarly, but may not resonate, for people on the ground, right, who are just trying to do day-to-day survivals around being Black?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're asking about the expanse of the movement's politics, and how that can be or potentially harnessed by those who are dealing with the day-to-day issues of moving through their own material conditions. To me, what's vital about this capacious understanding of Blackness and bringing all those other things in, a critique of the state, the nation state, a critique of heteropatriarchy, is a way to actually attend to Black life. Right? Black life is not monolithic. Black life isn't just one, singular figure positioned like the Black male or something like that, right?
Right.
The way that you can actually attend to Black life is by recognizing the different ways that the Black experience is impacted by the various structures of domination that we live under. And so you're not attending to Black life if you're not talking about heteropatriarchy, right? You're not attending to Black life if you're not talking about capitalism, right? You're not attending to Black life if you're not concerned with trans and gender nonconforming folks, and on and on and on. And so, what's brilliant, I think, about this moment is that capacious understanding of Blackness and what it yields in terms of the structural analysis and critique that one comes to by attending to all Black life.
I'm thinking of the work, of course, of the late, great Bell Hooks, this idea from margins to center. And the genius of the movement for Black Lives is that, in fact, brought Black people, Black folk from the margins of Blackness into the center of the politics, right? So when you talk about, centering the lives and experience of those who are positioned the farthest away from power in Black life, right? Black women, trans and gender, nonconforming, immigrants, the poor, and the differently abled. And at the same time, again, drawing on these kind of straw people that exist in our community, I remember having distinct conversations more than once over the years with fraternity brothers that when they hear Black Lives Matter, one of their first responses is that, well, Black Lives Matter is anti-Black family, right? And in part, that's a response to the centering of marginalized Black people to this conversation. How do we bridge that gap? Right. And some of it is generational. And we get some of that, but some of that is also the byproduct, as you write in the book, of misogyny and patriarchy and homophobia, transphobia, et cetera. But how do we bridge that gap politically? Because it strikes me that in some ways, for the earlier generations, good or bad, these issues were there, right? They were on the margins, but they were there, and they kind of set them aside, kick the can down the road, right, in order to achieve very specific goals, right? Desegregation, voter rights, et cetera, et cetera. But in this moment, how do we find a way to bridge that political gap?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a big challenge, right? Especially when you talk about generational divide, and people who came up a certain way and a certain understanding of things like the family, right? Which might be divergent from how people, of my generation and younger understand something like the family. One of the most powerful sentiments that I encountered while being a part of BYP 100, and I write about it a little bit in the book during a campaign called Our Streets, Our Bodies, Our Voices, was just the importance of talking to people, right?
Yeah.
The importance of having the difficult conversations, the importance of challenging someone's response. So I have to take seriously if you come to me and you're like, the Black family is disintegrating because of queer, transgender, nonconforming folks, or whatever stuff that folks would say, right? I have to take you where you're at. I obviously I disagree, but I have to take seriously that you came to that for whatever reasons. And if we're going to change, the way our world works, it's going to start with these types of conversations where you get to say your piece and I get to challenge it.
Right.
Why do we have such a static view of the family? Well,
right.
why does love have to be limited to a certain framework? Where did that come from? Those types of conversations don't always lead you to where you want to go. Sometimes you got to know when to move away. But right. The point is to talk to each other, and that's Autumn Robinson, who was the brains behind Our Streets, Our Bodies, Our Voices, said that, and it's simple but very profound. Yeah. We need to just talk to each other.
There's a way in which contemporary political culture has been reduced to sports metaphors. We talk about whether it's debates, we're talking about who's winning, who lost in very absolute terms. And I guess, for some folks, 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, when there's another accounting of the movement for Black lives, how would you respond to the question about what the real victories were of that moment or this moment?
Yeah. I mean, I think you suggested it, right, in bringing up the sports metaphor thing. It's like we're thinking about things the wrong way.
Wrong way. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, because so let's take an example. We think about the legislative victories of the 60s. Those were wins, right?
But were they? Right.
But were they? Yeah, right. Like I said, it's important that happened. But we all know that didn't actually create a dramatic change in the structural conditions of Black life. So if we just take it as wins and losses, or think about it legislatively, or whatever it might be, we're going to get ourselves into we're going to tie ourselves in knots. Right. We're going to tie ourselves in knots in a couple of different ways. The first way is that it confines us to understanding victory within the context of the system as it is. So a legislative victory, that's not the structural transformation we want, even though it's important to achieve those things to mitigate against the violences that people face. Right. So there's that kind of failure of political imagination when we think about that. And the other part of it, and perhaps more significant, or just as significant, is that it blinds us to what movements actually achieve, right? Which isn't just a matter of wins or losses. It's about a shift in political culture, a shift in consciousness. This is why I define the movement not just in terms of organizations and activists and cultural workers. Organizations fail, people fail. We know this. We've seen it within the context of this movement. But the shift in the way Black people are orienting towards Blackness, that's crucial, right? And even generational divides, there might be, and divides within particular generations is not monolithic, but there's no going back from that. Where I'm not trying to talk about a teleological progression. It's not inevitable, but we've made important strides that we're not returning from, and that's a win if you want to use the metaphor of wins and losses. And so I think the power of this movement and this moment is going to be in the change that it's facilitated in Black and other Black and non-Black people alike.
Yeah. The Breonna Taylor, George Floyd moment, for many Americans, the response to it seemed to come out of nowhere. For those who have been deeply involved, or even as curious observers of the movement for Black lives, what happened wasn't a surprise, right? Because there had been an infrastructure built there, right, for 7 to 8 years, right? You could even argue, even before Trayvon Martin, how Black folks use social media to rally around the state killing of Troy Davis.
He was put to death despite major doubts about evidence used to convict him of killing police officer Mark McPhail, including the recantation of 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses at his trial. They say they were threatened.
Creates, a scaffolding, right? At least in terms of social media, where when Trayvon Martin happened, folks just knew what to do and how to organize. Many white Americans, had not paid enough attention to Black Lives Matter, didn't pay attention to what it was doing, how it shifted certain kinds of politics. So the response to George Floyd's killing seemed a surprise. have you been surprised about how quickly America seemed to be on the brink of a real transformational moment, and is almost gone 180 degrees in opposition to that as politics have played out, 3 years since then?
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all. I was not surprised at the magnitude of the uprisings for the reasons that you stated. It's not simply, I mean, Black Lives Matter didn't come out of nowhere, right? There was years and years and years of the making. This was years in the making, and people were gradually, kind of getting tuned into and turned on to what Black folks have been talking about for a long time. That's why it was multiracial, right? People were seeing it, so that made sense to me. But the backlash also makes sense, right? There's always a backlash, and it's not surprising. What I would caution though for folks, right, is to I hear a lot of people speaking about this 180 that you're referencing, and speaking about it as if 2020 was a failure, right? or as if there is no more movement, right? And that would be a mistake. Right? So none of those, neither the uprisings or the backlash to the uprisings are surprising. But what is surprising to me is the way that people continuously fail to recognize the ebb and flow of these types
movement.
Of things.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. And
absolutely.
So, it may seem like we're on the backside because of the 180, because of the reaction. But remember, as I was saying before, the people still remember the burning of that police precinct in Minneapolis. People have pictures, paintings, pictures of burned out police cars, right? There's a memory of that people hold. Many people joined organizations, I'm sure, during that time, right? Many people were radicalized during that time. That doesn't just go away because the presence of people on the streets has waned, right? It's that culture that I'm talking about, that I was mentioning before, right? That's going to stick with people, and the next time something pops off like it did in 2020, we can expect it to be even bigger, even more forceful.
Right. And to your point, right, the same ways that folks still respond to the images of the dogs being sicked on to civil rights kids right in the 1960s, right? Those images have an evergreen effect, right? Continue to be a reference, archival in that regard. One of the things you do very well in the book is to not make this a book about personalities, right? And obviously there are personalities that have been attached to Movement for Black Lives at various moments that may or may not be controversial to people. Even when we look at kind of classic texts about the civil rights movement, a lot of it still remains to be, personality driven. Even as we look at this, reevaluation of someone like Bayard Rustin, which absolutely needed to happen, right? It is a personality driven narrative, as I suppose one day will be in terms of when someone decides to do a narrative film about Ella Jo Baker, right? In that context. How important was for you to tell the story of the everyday folks that were engaged in this organizing in this moment, and not make it a book about, these famous personalities that became well known in this moment?
Yeah, great question. It was vital because movement isn't about personality.
Right.
It's never been. Right. And I think that there's a bit of intention in today's iteration of Black struggle to be more leaderful, by which at least I take that to mean that everybody can be a leader, right?
Yep.
It's not that you don't have leaders, but everybody can be, and it's just about people having the opportunity and the training to
provide leadership.
To provide leadership. So it would be disingenuous to to write a book about the movement for Black lives in any other way
Yeah.
than to try to capture the everyday people more than what household names. And the other part about it, as I was saying earlier, is that it's also because the movement is not just about institutions, individuals, or organizations. It is about this culture, and you can see this culture manifest both in traditional organizing spaces, but also online. That's why I write about online initiatives and social media, capturing the essence of the movement, being representations of the movement. And that allows us to actually take seriously what the movement is and what it has accomplished outside of, as we were talking about before, the kind of wins and losses paradigm.
We've all been earnest graduate students who went into our dissertation and our research with a clear sense of what we thought we were going to find. Was there anything that came out of this research process for you that just quite frankly surprised you, that you didn't expect to find when you began this work?
Yeah. I mean, I have to take it back to the personal on that. I mean, I did not expect to be transformed personally and politically in the way that I was. I didn't expect to recognize the ways that I hadn't been holding myself accountable for the way that I wear society's, approaches to the world, right? And to challenge that in myself. Mary Hooks, who's a Southern Black organizer, has this mandate, which is a popular chant or call and response in the movement. And one of the lines is that in that mandate is to be willing to be transformed in the service of the work. Yeah. And so I think what surprised me was how much myself and then others were actually taking on that difficult task of being willing to be transformed in the service of the work. And I think that is the thing that surprised me the most, but also, and along similar lines, just how innovative and experimental Black folks are, right?
Yeah.
And that's not really surprising, because when you look at the history, of Black history, but that's who we are. But when you see it up close and kind of on the fly, or the beauty and love that Black folks bring to Black struggle and Black life, is always amazing to see, and surprising at just how much some Black folks love Black folks and what they're willing to do in support of Black life. And part of that is, again, being willing to be transformed.
It's probably bad form to ask you 5 minutes after your first book dropped, but what's next for you, Professor Harris?
No, I mean, the time span of writing a book is very long, and one goes into different modes of relationships with things. So you hate it, you love it, you hate it, you love it. So in a moment of hate, I had, was really tired of thinking about the book, and was definitely thinking about the next project. But now I've been sucked back into thinking about
the book. Yeah.
But I do think I'm interested in exploring a unified theory of abolition. By which I mean that, sometimes I make a claim in the book, and other people make this claim too, but it's not as widespread as you would think, that abolition is not just about the carceral state or carceral power, but it's about Western civilization as such. Right? It is about the necessity of tearing down and making new. So I want to kind of explore more deeply by bringing together the different threads of how people talk about abolishing the family, abolishing the carceral state, abolishing gender. There's a lot of ways that
Right.
people are kind of talking about this, and I think that there's a need for an articulation that brings these strands together in a clear way, and that also, I think, ties abolition to a critique of political economy. So, attaching it to the Marxist revolutionary tradition. So that the book that I'm working on, or that I was working on before I had to, the pleasure of talking to people like you, is called The Last President, and so that's the kind of framework for that. It's still, in the process of becoming, obviously, but
understood.
That is the direction.
We've been joined today by Professor Christopher Paul Harris, Assistant Professor in the Department of Global and International Studies at the University of California, Irvine. He is the author of To Build a Black Future, The Radical Politics of Joy, Pain, and Care, which our friend Kathy Cohen has written. That Harris demonstrates how Movement for Black Lives is working to build a new movement rooted in Black queer feminisms that reimagines how we work for the freedom of Black people and all people. Thanks for joining us today, Professor Harris.
Thanks for having me.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.